Hello, I'm Edmund DeMarsh with the Trends Journal. I'm here today with Ray McGovern, the former CIA analyst and author at raymcgovern.com. I suggest everyone go and check it out, raymcgovern.com. Ray, it seems like you're the perfect guest to have today because of what's going on in China between the meeting with Putin, Xi Jinping, and Kim Jong-un now. He's even joined he's going to be joining the military parade. You wrote me an email and you mentioned how your first, when you were working as an analyst, your first job was the Russian relationship with China back in 1964. And Ray, so from your expertise, you also mentioned that the meeting you see as a tectonic shift right now playing out between the meetings with these three. Here's what you wrote to me in an email. You said, it's a graphic symbol, you're referring to the meeting right now, of the growing power of the East and Putin's reluctant acknowledgement, essentially, that, well, Peter the Great gave it a good try, but no more Mr. Nice Guy towards Europe, especially since Putin believes Trump feels the same way. This marks a tectonic shift in the balance of power, or what the Soviets used to call the world correlation of forces. Ray, is this, you obviously mentioned that you see this as a significant shift and a significant message to the West. Can you talk about that and what you see from an analyst perspective?
Yeah, I'd be delighted to. This is real fun for me. My God, it's 360 degrees away from how I started watching Sino-Soviet relations. In those days, early 60s, even down to the late 60s, Russia and China were at each other's throats. They were shooting at each other across the riverine borders. China was claiming 1.5 square kilometers of territory in Russian Siberia, seized by the czars under unequal treaties. Now, was that a legitimate claim? You betcha it was, okay? The Treaty of Nerchinsk, if I can remember, is about 1656 or so. And there was one Russian went out there and he put down a staff and a Russian flag. Okay, now this is part of Russia, okay? There were unequal treaties because Russia, even though relatively weak vis-a-vis the West, was very strong vis-a-vis a kind of a China that was just dealing with lots of strange emperors and divisions within China. So there was this hostility, the more so since they were both communist and they both aspired to lead the communist world at that time. So we had carte blanche to report on this because people were interested. Now, were there people that were saying, now you're taking in Mcgovern, for God's sake, they're both commies, that's commies. This is all something they made up here to deceive us. Well, it was hard because some of these people were people like James Angleton of CIA and many policymakers. And it was hard because we didn't have the kind of collection opportunities we have now. Now, let me take you back in history. We had U-2 flights. Those were great big aircraft that flew over and took photos of Russia. And we also had some primitive satellites. Now, let's go to the satellites. That was starting to get that photography, maybe 1964, 65. Okay. Now, what do we get? Well, the satellites would photograph this part of Russia. And then after they've been there for 30 seconds, they drop down a bucket. Okay. And then the US Navy catch the bucket before it falls in the ocean in the Pacific. Sometimes they caught it. Most times they didn't, but it floated, right? So they picked it up, put it on a plane, took it to Rochester, New York, where the Kodak processing place was. And all the people from what was part of the CIA was called the National Photographic Interpretation Center. They'd get on a plane, go up to Rochester, and pore over this thing 24/7 and try to pick out what was, what intelligence could be gleaned from this. I got a call one time from a good friend of mine from NPIC, the National Photographic Interpretation Center. He's up in Rochester, and he said, "Oh, Ray, you're going to be so delighted when I tell you what I got here from these photos." And I said, "Well, what is it?" He said, "Come on, Ray, I can't tell you over this all night." So the next day, he shows up in my office, and he's got a photo of the Sino-Soviet border with 15 Soviet divisions aligned, a crackerjack divisions, motorized rifle divisions, elite ones right on the Chinese border.
What year is this, Ray? What year? What year is this?
1965, 1966. So what we're talking is, then I could go to the James Angletons of this world and say, "Hey, what do you think these Soviet divisions are doing on the Chinese border if they're not afraid of the Chinese?" Or So what I'm saying here is it was hard to prove that case, but finally it was so obvious. They kept calling each other great power chauvinists and faux leaders of the Communist Party and all that kind of stuff. And finally, it became clear that we could probably profit from this break, from this hostility between Russia and China. Now, one reason this is so much fun for me is I was chief of the Soviet foreign policy branch in early 1970s. Now, why is that relevant? Well, Kissinger and Nixon were really smart guys, okay? And they thought, well, maybe we could take advantage of this disparity, this cleavage between these two communist giants. And they looked at us and they said, "You think we could?" And we said, "Well, they hate each other. They're not going to make up anytime soon." And so, the story, Kissinger went to Beijing, 1971. Big surprise, met with Zhou Enlai, the premier, and Mao Zedong, right? And then what do you know? But in 1972, January, I think it was, Nixon goes to China, and they're drinking champagne or whatever it is, and it's so the Russians are looking on at this and say, "Oh my God, are we going to let the Chinese steal a march on us in relationship with the U.S.? My God, we got a triangular relationship now, right? We're going to make it lopsided in our disfavor." And as I say, we were watching Soviet foreign policy across the board, and we looked and we saw, oh, wait a second, the Russians are showing new flexibility on a quadripartite agreement on access to Berlin. My God, they have shown that flexibility before. So we told Nixon and Kissinger, look, it looks like it's working, and actually the strategic arms limitation talks, which are going on as we were speaking then, they're probably going to be more flexible there too. And indeed, they were. So here's Kissinger to me. Ray, do you think they're interested in arms control? Well, speaking for the agency, yes, of course they are. They don't want to be spent into oblivion, and they want a measure of security. Wow. You think they want a good relationship with us? Yeah, I think they do. Well, there was flexibility on our side too. So we kept people in Washington informed. I had 3 people working on this in my branch. One of them was a fellow named Robert Gates. He sought fame and fortune as the head of the Defense Department, as well as head of the CIA. He was a entry guy there. I put him on this rotation. I had one person in Helsinki or Vienna, where the negotiations was taking place, one person with the military experts on the analysis part of the CIA, and then one person looking at all this stuff day to day and reporting to Director Helms at the time and others to keep people in Washington informed. Oh yeah, there's more flexibility here and so forth. Now, long story short, I get to go to Moscow for the signing of the first major Strategic Arms Control Treaty, the so-called Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty in May of 1972. Jack Matlock, who is my opposite number at state as head of the Soviet desk there, he and I worked so hard on this, I got to go over there, okay? And it was so exciting. I mean, I'm one of those guys that hid under my desk in grammar school, right? Because of Russian atomic bombs. And now we have this agreement. In short, it was a very clever agreement because the only thing we could agree on, and that is with us building more and more offensive strategic arms, including submarine-launched ballistic missiles, there was an attempt to build anti-ballistic missile systems. In other words, put in sights around your country that would have some prayer or some chance of shooting these things down. We told our betters that this is probably unlikely to succeed and be prohibitively expensive in any case, but probably wouldn't work. So let's do a deal. Let's limit the number of ABM, anti-ballistic missile sites, in each country, so neither country can ever think that they could make an offensive strike without suffering incredible retaliation in return. So we limited to 2 sites, later 1 site, and we all signed on, and that treaty remained in effect. And it was a balance of terror, but it was balance, and it remained in effect until George W. Bush, I decided, well, John Bolton tells me I should get out of this treaty. So 30 years later, 30 years of security, Bush gets out of the treaty, and now there have been a couple of successive treaties. There's one that's about to expire in February. We need to renew that. But what I'm trying to say here is that this Sino-Soviet rivalry, it was really intense in the 60s and the 70s. It could be exploited, and it was exploited. And this triangle, your relationship there, became something that was really important to the Russians and to the Chinese. Now, what's it like now? Well, because of inept U.S. foreign policy, it used to be kind of an equilateral triangle, if you remember your geometry. Okay, so it used to be like this, and now it's isosceles, okay, with Russia, the big arm here, or China, the big arm here, and the U.S. getting the short end of the stick, okay? And that's made manifest this week in Beijing and earlier at the Shanghai Cooperation Council. It's made manifest in such a way that, when I look back at right after the war, I was alive during the war, the Second World War, and I thought how the U.S. policy was devised. I think this is really what I used to teach a lot, and I have one thing that I'd like to cite here from George Kennan. Now, George Kennan used to be my patron. I mean, nobody knew more about the Soviet Union than George Kennan, and he was right about trying to contain them, and we successfully contained them. But he was in power right after the war, and he was chief of the policy planning staff, newly created under that defense arrangement there in 1947. And so he wrote this first policy planning memo. It's just a couple of sentences, but if you listen to it carefully, you can see the tectonic change. Here it is. I quote: "We, the United States, have about 50% of the world's wealth." This is 1948. We only have 6.3% of the world's population. So we cannot fail to be the object of envy and resentment because of this disproportionality. So our real task in the coming period is to create a pattern of relationships that permits us to maintain this unequal disparity. Now, to do that, we have to dispense with all sentimentality. Now get this. Here's George Kennan. "Dispense with all sentimentality and daydreaming. our attention will have to be concentrated everywhere. Our attention has to be concentrated everywhere on our immediate national objectives. We must cease talking about vague and unreal objectives like human rights, like raising living standards, like democratization. He's talking foreign policy abroad. We must cease to talk about those vague and unreal objectives. And the last sentence is the clincher. The day is not far off when we are going to have to deal in straight power concepts, period, end quote. Okay, now you can understand that. After the war, we won. Our country was spared the worst of it. The Russians, 27 million killed. The Chinese, about the same, okay? They're on their backs. We have this disparity of wealth. We're only 6.3% of the world's population, but we don't have dominion over about 50% of the world's resources. Well, okay, fast forward. What is it now? Well, we're 4% of the world's population. And if you look at the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and their meeting just yesterday and the day before, the best figures are about 44% of the world's population are embodied in those folks that were there in China. And so it was 6.3% Americans. Now it's 4% Americans of the world's population. The people in China, Russia, China, India, well, think about their populations. They're all there in China. They'll be at the big parade tomorrow and the next day. So the parade, well, what's the parade marking? The parade's marking the end of World War II in the Pacific. And just to finish up here, I'm sorry to go so long, but you can see I'm pretty enthusiastic about all this. So what we have here, when I was a kid, there was a war going on. I was born 1 week before Hitler sent his tanks into Poland, okay? So I'm going up, I'm an adolescent. I said, "Gee, the Great War, you know, it was us and the British and French and the Russians, and we beat those Germans, and we beat the Japanese too. We used to call them dirty words and all kinds of stuff because, you know, there was a racial element to it, but we beat them, right? We beat them now. So who was it that beat them? Well, it was Russia, actually. And China played a big role. And yeah, they started in the early 30s with the Japanese invasion. So we have Japanese and we have the Germans. And now, what does it look like now? Oh, well, now we have the Russians not as allies, but as quasi-enemies. And what are we doing with the Germans? Oh, we're giving them intermediate range ballistic missiles to shoot at fire at the Russians. And what about the Japanese? Well, the Japanese are not coming to the celebration tomorrow and the next day for obvious reasons. They haven't made their peace, so to speak, with what happened to Japan in those days, or the savagery that they wreaked mostly in China. So what are the Japanese getting? Oh, they're getting a new intermediate range ballistic missile called a Typhoon, and it has a range of 1,000 miles. So it can hit parts of China and parts of Russia and the Far East. So, hello, screw you. What's happened in the last 80 years? Well, all I could say to finish up here, it's been very, very exciting watching all this. But my God, it's not very sensible what's happened to the world. And worst of all, the people in the major European capitals can't seem to realize that the power has shifted to the east. And the Russians, for example, have said, all right, yeah, Peter the Great was right. He wanted to break a window into Europe, and that worked out okay, 1700, okay, but now, I mean, close the window and seal it up, for God, to caulk it up. We're going to the east. We're going up in these guys until they wake up. Now, Ukraine's got to be solved, but the attitude is, look, these guys in the East, including China, are going to be behind us as we solve this. And the Americans also are fed up with the coalition of the brain dead, is what I call them, the Macron and Merz and
Starmer.
Starmer and all this. Anyhow, that's how we're coming at it. And sorry to take so long, but maybe you can catch the drift of my excitement to be an observer of all this and be still able to write and speak about it with the depression that comes of knowing that, God, this didn't need to be. We were allies once, and there's no need for us to be anything other than that now, except for some crazy policies on the US's part, which have driven China and Russia together. And if that weren't enough, now India. So, it's not only 2 against 1 now, it's 3 against 1. And look at the world population and the world economic power. And unless we change our policy, unless we understand that we're not the hegemon anymore, and unless we stop trying to be the hegemon, this is going to come, what the Chinese usually say, this will come to a no good end.
If I had someone like Mike McFaul, the former ambassador to Russia, if he was here right now, something tells me he would say, well, Russia will always be subservient to China. Russia needs China more than China needs Russia. And when you have a relationship like that, it's hard to have something completely mutually beneficial. That I read recently that Russia gives 18% of its trade to China, while China trades with Russia only 2% of its products from the world. So if someone were to tell you, this is just Russia desperately trying to hang on to Beijing and keep that relationship going, and China knows that Russia, they'll even say, is a vassal state to China, do you think that there's any credibility there in that argument from former diplomats that it's not a mutually beneficial relationship, it's China using Russia?
Well, McFaul has been wrong about a lot of things. Some academicians just can't cope with the notion that they've been so wrong for so long. Now, we need to leave it up to Putin and Xi Jinping to decide whether this mutual relationship is a big help to either or both, or if one gets more advantage than the other. But I'll give you, now I come from the Bronx, and we used to say, I'll give you a for instance, huh? I'll give you, you want a for instance? Okay, so here's an example. So Putin is trying to get the Europeans and the US, NATO, to recognize that its core interests, the Russian core interests, are such that they will not permit Ukraine to go into NATO. Okay, so what happens? Well, the US and the Western services do a coup d'etat in Kiev in February 2014. And then the Ukrainian army starts firing at the Russian speakers in southeastern Ukraine, in the Donbass, and they call for protection from Russia. What happens? Well, there are various agreements, ceasefires. 2 of them are called the Minsk agreements, and those were instituted with the supervision of Germany and Germany and France. Okay, yeah, right, Germany and France, to make sure there was a ceasefire and nobody violated. The Ukrainians stopped firing at the Russian speakers in Donbass and vice versa. Now, those were violated hither and yon. There was one provision whereby the people in the Donbass would be given a measure of autonomy in a new Ukrainian constitution. Live and let live, give them their rights back, give them the right to speak their own language, for God's sake. Now that was violated for 8 years. Well, from 2015 until the invasion. Yeah, 7 years. Okay. So what happens? Well, the people who are supposed to monitor and ensure the effectiveness of this agreement, the Minsk agreements, well, were Angela Merkel from Germany, Francois Hollande from France, and after after all these agreements fell apart, they both, each of them, Merkel first said, "Oh God, those were those were agreements just to let the Ukrainian army be built up with NATO weapons, NATO training, so there'd be a NATO equipped and ready force." And they were nothing back in 2014. Now look at them. So we tricked Putin, and look at him now. And that is when Putin went into Ukraine. So what I'm saying here is that right before Putin went into Ukraine, one cannot speak of him being unprovoked. He was provoked. As a matter of fact, the head of NATO, a fellow named Jens Stoltenberg, used to be president of Norway, for God's sake. He says, look, now he's talking to the European Parliament, okay? And he says, look, what happened was the Russians gave us this draft treaty, and it said, no Ukraine in NATO. And we said, no. And they said, if you trying to get Ukraine and NATO, we will have to invade Ukraine. And we said, no. And so he invaded Ukraine, and Ukraine didn't get into NATO, but Finland did, and also Sweden, so we enlarged NATO anyway. He says to the European Parliament. By that time, 500,000 young Ukrainian and Russian youth have perished on the battlefield. This is 2 years ago. The Secretary General of NATO admitting that the Russians said, look, you keep trying to get Ukraine and NATO, we're going to have to react. Now, tying this all together, as Putin is meeting this rejection from the West, let me tell you this. Nobody knows this part of it because nobody watches what the Russian people say. This will take 1 minute or 2 minutes. Here it is, December of 2021, and Putin is watching this buildup by the Ukrainian forces in southern part of Ukraine, in the Donbass. So he gathers together his military leaders, all of them, all the four-star equivalent, and the Minister of Defense, and all, 21st of December. And he says, look, the situation is pretty serious because the Americans have bases in Poland and in Romania now, bases that can easily accommodate Tomahawk and other missiles. And that gives me 9 or 10 minutes to decide, well, he didn't say it this way, but to decide whether to blow up the whole world by retaliating, okay? So this is bad, but worse still, when the Americans get hypersonic offensive missiles like we have, they're going to put them in Ukraine. You can be sure of that. And the result of that, 4-5 minutes of warning I will have at best. Now I panned those frowns on the generals and the admiral. That's great. Well, I don't know exactly how this happened, but it was 21st, the 30th. So what's that? 9 days later, the White House gets a call from the Kremlin. Mr. Putin, President Putin would like to really speak to President Biden, like right away. And the White House is nonplussed. You know, they said, "Well, wait a second. They just talked 2 weeks ago, and we have Geneva negotiations taking place in 2 weeks. So why is it? Please, out of respect, President Putin wants to talk to President Trump. I mean, President Biden. Okay, so what happens? Well, to his credit, Biden takes the call, but he's home alone for Christmas. Okay. No joke intended, but he's home alone in Delaware. He's not got Tony Blinken and he's not got Sullivan as his side. He takes the call, and Putin says, "Look, Mr. President, we're going to start negotiations now. But, what would really help is if you would forswear any desire to put offensive strike missiles in Ukraine. We know you're going to get these hypersonic missiles by and by. Could you just promise not to put them in Ukraine? You already have them in Poland or the capability in Poland and Romania, and Biden thinks that's reasonable, which I also think. And he said, okay. So the readout of that conversation says the President of the United States said that he has no intention of putting offensive strike missiles in Ukraine, period, end quote. So what happens? Well, our negotiators, Wendy Sherman was the head of our delegation at Yapkov, head of the Russian. They meet in Geneva on the 9th and 10th of January, just a week or 10 days later. And so Ryabkov, Sergei Ryabkov, the deputy foreign minister, he says, now, Wendy, let's get to business here. Let's sit down the modalities for this undertaking your president made not to put offensive missiles in Ukraine. And Wendy says, huh? Come again? He says, you saw the readout and you know what happened. So let's talk about. He said, well, I don't have any instructions on that. What's it? Tell me about it. So about 12 days later, Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, tracks down his opposite number, Tony Blinken, in Geneva. And he says, Tony, there's no progress in these talks here because you people won't recognize or acknowledge that promise that Biden made on the 30th of December, just 2-3 weeks ago, not to put offensive strike missiles in Ukraine. What's going on? And Blinken says, Lavrov, he never got the pronunciation right. Mr. Lavrov, look, Biden was home alone. It was Christmas, for God's sake. I wasn't there. Sullivan wasn't there. Forget about it. That's not going to happen. We have every right to put offensive strike missiles in Ukraine, and we're going to do it. If the Ukrainians ask us, they probably will. Now, we might be able to talk about limiting the number of them or something like that, but forget about that undertaking that you're talking about. 2 weeks later, the conversation between Biden and Putin, the readout on the 12th of February now, just 10 days or 12 days before the invasion, the readout says Mr. President Biden refused to discuss, number one, any objective of keeping offensive strike missiles out of Ukraine, and number two, anything having to do with Ukraine's right to join NATO. Okay, that's the 12th of February. On the 24th, I guess it was, the Russians go into Ukraine. So the Russian knew that the Ukrainian forces were massed on the border of Ukraine. The shelling increased against Donbas villages exponentially. I could show you a chart on that if you want. But the monitors from the Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe were there on the scene. They recorded all this, and I have a graph that just won't quit. Will show you that there were about 500 shellings in, let's say, February 12th, up to about 10 times that in February 18th or something like that. So now this is the OSCE, a Western-dominated group, but they recorded all this because that was their job. They put out a graph, and now, last thing I'll say on this is that we have an OSCE, Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, inspector, a French lieutenant colonel, retired, who was there monitoring the ceasefire, such as it was, along that line. And he kept reporting the disastrous effects on Ukrainian villages, the Russian-speaking people there. And they would say, well, that's just anecdotal. His bosses in the OSCD, oh, that's just anecdotal. And so he got really frustrated. Now he's spilling the beans. He's showing that under the undue influence of the West, OSCE, even though it was recording this exponential increase in shellings and the fact that Russian forces were massed on the border of Donbass, that not that got public, but of course Putin knew it. And the only other thing I'll add here, because it's so damn relevant and brings us back to China. I was wrong on this. It's embarrassing. I was one that saw the Soviets massing their troops across the border from Ukraine. And I'm thinking, well, yeah, they're trying to make a point. Now, this is a good example of using diplomacy and power projection at the same time. I didn't think that Putin would go into Ukraine just then. What I didn't know, of course, was that all those troops were arrayed against the Donbass, nor did I know, nor does anyone know to this day, that the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe was recording an exponential increase in the shelling. So what happened? Why do I make this point? Putin goes up to China. It was a prearranged visit. It was the 4th of February, 2022. And he sees Xi Jinping. They were launching the Winter Olympics, which were happening in Beijing. So he says, Comrade Xi, I have a real problem here. Biden's made these promises. Blinken and Sullivan say, forget about it. They're massed on the border of the Donbass. I have to protect my Russian-speaking, my Russian stock people. So I'm gonna have to take care of this. I'm gonna have to invade Ukraine. What do you think? My notion of Xi is you mean after the Winter Olympics are over, right? Oh yeah, of course. We would do it before the Winter Olympics are over. And guess what? The Winter Olympics stopped or ended on the 20th of February, 2022. Donbass, that is Donetsk and Lugansk, declared independence the next day. The Russians said, okay, we'll come to your aid the next day. The Russian Duma approved that the following day. And on the 24th, there was the invasion of Ukraine. So what's my point? My point is this, that when Putin raised this with Xi, he knew darn well that China's bedrock policy since centuries was no interference in the internal affairs of others, no violating borders. It's the principles of Westphalia. The Chinese were so. That's why I was sure that the Chinese would never wink at this. Well, they winked. And what Xi said was, okay, well, just don't do it while the Olympics are going on, and we'll support you. Last thing on this, did they support Putin? Well, sure they did. Sure as hell they did. All of a sudden, Westphalia and non-interference in the affairs of other countries disappeared from Chinese rhetoric. And they chose to insist otherwise. They said, well, look, every country has core interests and existential threats. And when they have core interests and existential threats, this is what they do. This is what Putin did. And the short of saying, yeah, we're right behind Putin, they did everything to say, well, we're in this together. We have a common threat. After they're done with you, they'll probably come after us. So that alliance, no matter what people like McFall say, that alliance is 2 against 1 now. And it's very clear that they're outmatched us, not only in population, but as far as the Russians are concerned. For the first time in my monitoring Russian weaponry, they outmatch us in weaponry as well. On the strategic level, not so much, but on all other levels, including hypersonic missiles, which for some reason we still don't have. And the Russians and the Iranians and the Chinese all have them. So not only is this kind of unbalanced in disfavor of the United States, but that extends to the military situation. No longer are we the hegemon. No longer can we pretend, as George Kennan did. Well, he didn't pretend; he was right. We did have domain over 50% of the world's wealth, and we were only 6.3% of the population. Mm-hmm. Now we're down to 4% of the population. And now the world's wealth, a lot of it still is in Russia and China and elsewhere, personified by the people who are even now congregating for the big parade today or tomorrow, depending on which time zone you're in Beijing, celebrating the defeat of the Japanese, who waged war, a terrific, savage war against China from 1921 until 1945. Okay, so the alliances have changed. We picked a real fight against Russia, who was our ally, against the Germans and the Japanese. And the supreme irony is now we're arming Germany and Japan with the kind of intermediate range ballistic missiles that can hit Russia. And Russia's going to have to react to that in some way or other. I don't know. It's full of irony, but it's been very exciting watching all this. Thanks for your patience in listening to Professor Mcgovern.
I have a few. I'm thrilled that you're sharing it with the Trends Journal. I appreciate it, Ray, and everyone who's just tuning in. I'm with Ray McGovern from RayMcGovern.com, former CIA analyst. Ray, who's the more natural ally today for the United States? Who should the United States be more interested in forming an alliance, a strategic alliance? Would it be India, China, or Russia? If Marco Rubio was on the phone right now saying, what would you say, given what we know today, who's the natural ally for the US out of those three? And most important?
Yeah. Well, from a strategic point of view, the Russians can do us in strategically in the blink of an eye. The Chinese, almost. The North Koreans can hit every part of the United States with new ballistic missiles given to them by Russia 2 years ago. Big secret, kept under wraps by the NSC. India, we used to enjoy a relatively cordial relationship with them for lots of reasons. But the geniuses that are advising Trump on these tariffs and stuff say, well, yeah, let's slap 25% tariffs on. No, let's make it 50%. Those Indians, they won't be able to cope with that. Of course, the Indians can cope with that. So in terms of natural allies, it depends on whether there's any sanity in Washington. The Russians were our natural allies against the Germans. The Germans today are showing symptoms of wanting to go back to being, as their chancellor has said, the most powerful army in Europe. Whoa, we know what happened last time that happened, right? And they're depriving their citizens of social benefits just to build up all these weapons. The military-industrial complex, of course, will profiteer on this, but not the German people. And if they think they can match Russia, well, they're really hallucinating. Now, China is building up. So it's really hard to answer a question. Now, Rubio would ask that kind of question. Witkoff would not. Witkoff is 10 times smarter than Rubio. Well, that's damning with faint praise, but it's true. Witkoff would probably say, well, how do we get out of this fix? My God, these clowns have got us in a terrible situation. And I would say, look, put Ukraine behind you. The Russians have said, and told you more than I know, they've said that they have a certain flexibility on getting an understanding and agreement on Ukraine, that they will show flexibility. Their word, okay? They don't want to take over the rest of Ukraine. That is their incentive. In other words, they can but they don't want another Vietnam. They don't want to be in the situation of fighting an insurgency for the next decade, okay? So they want to do, there's this pig of defeat, okay? The US, NATO, Ukraine has been defeated by the Russian army. They're all but finished with the Ukrainians up to the Dnieper River, okay? Now, will they stop? Of course they'll stop for the proper deal. All they need is a buffer zone, a cordon sanitaire, if you will, that will give them a measure of security, and then longer range understandings where Russian core interests will be taken into account. So that's where you start, Mr. Witkoff, and this is what you should tell the president. The other thing is, look, the Chinese, are the Chinese threatening us? Well, if you listen to the Pentagon or if you listen to the arms makers and the arms dealers, of course, they're a terrible threat. Why? Because they're so big and they got weapons. In our view, Mr. Witkoff, the Chinese have this attitude. We've been around for 4 or 5 millennia. We have lots to cope with 1.5 billion people in our country, and can't we just get along? I mean, we haven't invaded anybody for a long time, and how about this? How about a win-win? You keep your sophisticated aircraft carriers and other things and aircraft out of the South China Sea, and give us freedom of navigation, and we won't be feeling necessary to build even more sophisticated ICBMs. Can't we make an agreement here to have a sort of a win-win and spend this extra money on social programs? Now, that makes sense to me. It makes sense to the Chinese. And I hope either Trump or his successor will say, well, the only people who want war with China are the people who want to build ships, warships. Now, China has more warships than we do now. Now, they're not as sophisticated or not as big, but look at the width of the Pacific Ocean, for God's sake. Are we going to prevail in a war against China? Of course not. All the war games show that we lose, okay? Are the Chinese going to attack Taiwan? No. They live and let live. They have a really close economic relationship with Taiwan. They don't like the U.S. selling a lot of arms to Taiwan, but eventually it's a done deal. Taiwan is now part of China and will be recognized as part of China. When I say is now, that was part of the deal. Nixon, Kissinger, 1971, 1972. Okay, Taiwan is an integral part of China. Well, that was more than 50 years ago. So why don't we go back to that? So in other words, these are manufactured threats. The Russians have developed weaponry now that we can't shoot down, okay? Their hypersonic missiles are such and so sophisticated that they're almost as powerful as a nuclear weapon. Why did they do that? Because they can, and because they couldn't get any satisfaction when they extended the hand and said, look, US, let's have a live. Let's go back to the intermediate range ballistic missile treaty, which Trump himself got out of in 2019. There's another one. And I'll just mention this one because people don't know much about this. When Gorbachev finally developed a really good relationship with Reagan, they were in Geneva and elsewhere. Gorbachev says to Reagan, look, we have this strategic balance. We have the anti-ballistic missile treaty. Neither of us thinks we can prevail in a nuclear war. So why the hell do we need intermediate range ballistic missiles, SS-20s in the European part of Russia, and Pershing II missiles already in base in Europe? Why do we need those things? Why don't we get rid of them? Reagan comes to us and he says, Mr. Gorbachev, he said this, and could that be done? And we said, why don't you try it? We'll work out the modalities, and we will make sure you can doverai no proverai. trust but verify. Now, who would have thought? And I was among the doubters. In 1987, when this accord was reached, who would have thought that the two great powers would agree to destroy a whole class of intermediate and shorter range ballistic missiles in place in the European part of Europe and Russia, and have inspections like my friend Scott Ritter, who was the first with boots on the ground, going to god awful place called Votkinsk, to make sure that these big missiles were chopped in half, literally, physically chopped in half. That worked. And they destroyed them all. Now, what happened? Well, my God, that was unprecedented in the history. I mean, ABM treaty was great, but the intermediate nuclear forces treaty lasted 3 years longer than the ABM treaty. 30 years for the ABM treaty. Bush got out of it. 33 years for this this intermediate range ballistic missiles treaty. I mean, 3 years longer. So what's the situation now? Well, the US got out of it, Russians got out of it, and now we see these same kinds of missiles, even more sophisticated, of course, now going into Germany under a bilateral agreement, not a NATO agreement, bilateral agreement with the Germans. And we see them already. The Stars and Stripes announced that these Typhoon missiles, 1,000-mile range, are going to be based in Japan. They announced that in the Stars and Stripes the very day that the Shanghai Cooperation Organization was convening in China. I mean, hello. When are these people going to get their heads screwed on right? Why do this kind of offensive challenge when we have a strategic balance and we don't need these things, because the Russians and the Chinese, as night follows the day, will match it and probably do a little better, as they have proved they're able to do over these last 2 decades.
Well, Ray McGovern, I can go on and hear your expertise on this subject. I appreciate you joining the Trends Journal today on such a busy news day. Next time we talk, I'd love to hear you discuss Gaza and what's going on there. It was just called by a group of scholars a genocide. So I think we'll have to talk about that next time. Ray, thank you for joining the Trends Journal.
Well, you're welcome. And let me just add that I always try to include something on genocide and on forced starvation. I'm Irish. I was lucky enough to have 2 grandfathers who escaped forced starvation in Ireland. So I know stories about what it's like. And now we see stories in our iPhones. My God, I never thought that I would be in a country that is enabling, that is arming and financing this, namely our country. I think it's shameful. And I think we all have to get off our rear ends and try to do something about it, whether it's with our Congress people or somehow or other demonstrate that this is not America. We don't favor genocide.
Ray McGovern, on that note, thank you so much.
Most welcome, Ed.